to introduce Francis. A little note just came up. It's my pleasure to introduce Francis, and it must be going back to about 2008, 2009, I think, Francis, that we interviewed people for towards a zero energy supermarket. The project was called ZEST, and we got funding from the Sustainable Consumption Institute, which was funded by Tesco's at Manchester University. They gave us, I seem to remember, about £21 million to do this, and we had a seed corn grant to look for how we could get a zero energy supermarket, and we had some very good candidates. Most of them had PhDs from some very illustrious universities as well, but they weren't necessarily in the right discipline. And we were mulling this over for quite some time. And then the suggestion came out in the interview panel that we were dealing with Tesco's and we wanted to get data out of them. And we thought that with the maturity of Francis and her personality, which came through, here was a woman that could actually get stuff out where youngsters might fear to tread. And I think I did actually say, I could see that when this project gets running, Francis will be running it and telling me what to do. But anyway, we started off and Francis started modeling these and found some really good results. They were good results from a research point of view, but they weren't very good results from what's done by the government, because she quickly found that in the modelling of supermarkets, the refrigeration systems were included in the modelling in the building regulation software as a heat source. And of course, the refrigerator in a home is the heat source. The condenser gives that heat at the back. But in a supermarket, the condensers are on the roof. So, and with the open cabinets, as there were in some supermarkets, they're a great cool source. And so this was quite a finding. And she also did a lot of work on how these supermarkets could actually have doors and have reasonable, sensible access, because a lot of people in supermarkets said, we want people to touch things. Once they've touched things, they might buy them. And so Francis worked on this, and the sad thing is that I don't think the results were taken on by the building regulations people at all. We fought for this, and I also remember that Francis found that in America, the supermarkets actually collaborate in their research because they say, we are interested in selling food and items like that. We're not bothered about refrigeration services. And they collaborated on actually getting the best refrigeration system, the best energy efficient supermarkets. And I remember I met Sir Terry Leahy, that was Chancellor of the university, and I mentioned this to him. And he said, well, that's the way things are. We're very competitive in this country. And Francis did her best, but Tesco's, well, perhaps we better not say too much, Francis, but it's very difficult to get data out. But Francis did a great job. And now she's working down at the Centre of Alternative Technology. And I think she's got an incredible number of students there. She works really hard. She's doing some excellent work there, telling these architects how to do sustainable buildings. And it's a pleasure. And one of the great privileges of working in the university is that you work with people like Francis. And then you see them go off in their careers and do some really great things. And I think Francis is one of these people, and not only has got the knowledge there, but she's also got the ethics. And she's a very formidable and good person. And it's a pleasure to see you, Francis. And I'm looking forward very much to what you've got to say tonight.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And over to you, Francis. Do share your screen and we're all ears and eyes.
Thank you, Jeff. And I'm not going to be talking to you about supermarkets today. You can rest assured on that one. If you want to talk to me about supermarkets, then find me another time is probably the best answer to that one. Sorry, just trying to work out how I get this to full screen, because it's jumped from where it should be. Sorry, not entirely used to Zoom. And
Are you trying to put it into presentation mode?
I am.
There's a
I think
little icon just above design.
All right, I've reached it. It was hiding behind my bottom bar there.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I teach through Microsoft Teams, which is a sort of similar tool, but different. They're all different. So yes, teaching at the Centre for Alternative Technology. We work more at the domestic level in terms of looking at zero carbon heating. Although we certainly do touch on commercial buildings as well, such as supermarkets, and the modelling of buildings to learn more. But fear not, I'm not heading out onto supermarkets today. So heating our homes into a zero carbon future, having our homes ready for the future, what do we need to do? We're going to first look at the challenge this evening, look at the current demand for heating and the current supply of energy available for heating. We'll look at some routes to solutions, including insulation and air tightness to reduce demand, and alternatives to gas or oil, which most of us currently use for heating. These, of course, include electricity, hydrogen, heat pumps, and the possibility of heat networks. So a statistic that is bandied around, or not necessarily with this number on it, but something like this, that 41% of our energy is from renewables, which suggests that we're well on our way from not having had renewables essentially 20, 25 years ago, beyond burning wood. That, you know, we're well on our way to being entirely energy supplied by renewables. But how does that fit into the domestic energy use data, which we've got here? You can see that the majority of domestic energy use is gas, with 6 or 7% from bioenergy, 6 or 7% from oil, and maybe 25% from electricity. Very little anymore from coal. So which part of that energy is from renewables? 41% doesn't readily fit in there. Well, in fact, yes, so about 3/4 of our energy is from fossil fuel, and about 1/4 is electricity. And that 41% is just 41% of our electricity provision is from renewables. So it's, well, sort of that much of our energy supply, our energy use, not just our electricity use, our energy use. So that 41% doesn't include that, you know, that the 100% of which that is 41% doesn't include the energy we use for heating, which makes it a wee bit frightening, really, when it comes down to it. I mean, this is the electricity from renewables. We then have electricity from fossil fuel. We have electricity from nuclear, which is perhaps carbon neutral. Various people would argue in various directions on that. So about 3/4 of our energy is used for heating, and that's about 8 times more than is currently generated from renewables, or 7 times more than renewables plus nuclear. Our total energy demand is about 7 times more. All right, I need to keep moving my screen of people around so that I can see what's behind it. And if we think of biofuels as renewable, and that's contentious, because once you've taken a tree out of production and you burn the carbon, it takes a long time for that carbon dioxide to be sequestered again into the next tree that you're growing in the same plot, or the next tree you plant. So these are the renewables. This is the energy from renewables. These might be considered low and zero carbon, but that still leaves 80% of our energy use as not even counting in those. So we've got quite a challenge if we're going to move not just our electricity demand, our current electricity demand into renewables, but all of our energy demand into renewables. Are we going to multiply up the energy electricity we're generating by a factor of 8 in order to be able to use electricity for all of this? That's a lot more wind farms, a lot more solar. We can probably do a lot. Can we get there? The other side of the question is that heating demand is very seasonally dependent. And although, this is the power that's generated sort of through the year, with more being generated in the winter than in the summer. That's hardly surprising. We're using our lights more in the winter than in the summer. We're driving more heating systems, as in, the pumps in heating systems and whatever else we're using more power for in the winter than in the summer. That variables seasonally. But look at the heating demand. That's varying hugely. Can we actually supply all of the heating, all of the energy we need, the power we need in the winter, even if we can supply all of the, an average of the energy around the year? Transport is more even on here. And yes, when we get something like the Beast from the East, this data run finished about 4 years ago, just after the Beast from the East, then we get a spike that's considerably higher than that when our heating demand goes up very considerably. And we need to think, how can we provide for all of that heating dependence? So various different routes that we need to look at to solutions. Right, we'll look at insulation and air tightness, but I think many of you will have been at Flo's talk on her house on insulation and air tightness. So we won't take a long time on that, but it is important. And we'll look at heating controls to reduce demand. And then, alternatives to gas and oil. So first of all, insulation. Looking at a standard house, where do we lose the heat from? You'll have all seen a picture something like this with probably somewhat different figures on it. And all of our homes vary. They vary on how much of the external envelope of the house is walls. They vary on how much insulation there is where, and whether we've got double glazing. But a broad picture average of home energy loss is that we lose maybe 25 to 30% through the walls, maybe 15% through the windows, maybe 30 to 35% through the roof, a lot through, ventilation or air change. Ventilation is sometimes limited to mean intentional ventilation. I think here it's meaning sort of all the air that comes and goes to the house that you didn't really intend to, as well as what you did. And then some up through chimneys perhaps, and out through the floor. So we need to approach all of those different losses in the house. So ideally, we're going to put in 250 to 300 millimeters. Now, just put your hands where I can see them, 250 to 300 millimeters apart, preferably upwards, because upwards is the direction that we've got loft insulation. Yeah. It's a foot in old money, a foot of loft insulation. We want to stop drafts and organize the ventilation so that we've got enough airflow, but not losing heat through the airflow more than we need, at least. So either extract ventilation that is perhaps humidity controlled and perhaps sits in your kitchen, your bathrooms, so that you're extracting from the smelly, damp places in the house, and you're inevitably going to be able to draw in, unless you've got a really, really good airtight house like Flo, you're almost certainly going to be able to draw in enough air through the cracks and crevices around the place that the house doesn't sort of implode on itself. It won't implode on itself, don't worry about that. Or mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. So that's balanced intake and extract ventilation with a heat recovery between the incoming air absorbing the heat from the outgoing air. We want to insulate our cavity walls. Those of us who've got cavity walls, we may be wanting to insulate internally. We may be better off insulating externally, because right here across the middle of the house, there's floors that come to the wall, and insulating internally down to the floor and then up to the ceiling below, you've got quite a gap there that is really hard to get at. And you've got a problem with bridging there. And so you're going to lose heat more readily through the area you can't insulate there. And you're going to have a cold wall, and a cold wall usually with timbers going into it. And that can be a problem, because that's where moisture gets into the wall and gets into the timbers in the wall. And you don't really want moist, damp timbers sitting in a cold place where they could rather readily rot. And then perhaps not, you may be surprised that this doesn't come higher priority up the list: double or triple glazing. It's not a quick win, a glazing replacement. It's quite neat and easy to do compared to a lot of the others. It's quite expensive, and it is important to do it, but it doesn't necessarily come above these other measures that you can take. Make sure double or triple glazing is carefully installed, because when we go back to look at stop drafts and organize extract ventilation, stopping drafts, a lot of the places where you get drafts are around the frames of windows and doors and skirting boards, and around ceilings and around lighting fittings and that sort of thing. But particularly there's a lot of edge around windows, and if they're not well installed, then they're hazardous for heat loss, for drafts around windows, but heat loss around them as well. So find somebody who knows how to install windows well. There are examples in Wilmslow who do it well, and there are examples in Wilmslow who don't. I'm not going to say more because I might get in trouble. So now we've got a house that's insulated as well as we've managed, draft proofed as well as we've managed. But even before we do that, we need to think about which rooms are we going to heat and how hot are we going to heat them to? Do we need to heat every room in the house, whether or not we live in it all the time? Some of us may be able to have homes that have rooms that we don't use on a regular basis. Do we shut the doors on them and leave them to cool down a bit? Or do we heat them sort of to the same as every other room? Questions to consider there. How hot, how warm do we need our homes to be? Do we need the same temperature in every room? Or can we use radiator thermostats to control the temperatures in the different rooms? Maybe you want a bit of heat in all the rooms, but you don't need as much in in quite all of them. You need a higher temperature when you're sitting down still. The room I'm sitting in at the moment is my home office. I share it with the hot water cylinder, the airing cupboard. It was a bedroom once, and it has the airing cupboard in it. And that means that whenever the well-insulated hot water cylinder leaks any heat from it, and it does through the pipework inserts to and fro, whenever it leaks heat, I actually benefit. So I sit here bathing in waste heat. Well, the room stays a degree or two warmer than the other side of the door as a result of heat losses from that. In the summer, I can open the window. It doesn't need to worry me that I'm getting extra warm then. We heat our house by solar water heating, sitting up on the roof above me. But that's an aside, really. Wasn't going to go into that today. So, and then, I think it says down here, but sorry, this is, yes, control, measure, monitor, and manage. Control the temperature, measure it perhaps, use a thermostat to measure it and manage it that way, and possibly manage it by additional controls. Avoid heating unnecessarily, use a timer. I'm aghast when neighbours go away for the weekend and I see the steam plume out of their boiler pouring out into the air. For a start, a boiler shouldn't particularly have much of a steam plume if it's been well commissioned. A bit, yes. But if you're away for the weekend, how much heating does the house need on? If you're away for the day, how much heating do you need on? Do you need the whole house as warm at night as you need some rooms during the day? How can you manage that? So suggestions for a timer: that you might have the heating on for half an hour before you need the house to be at full warmth, and probably be able to turn it off half an hour before you no longer need it warm. Or maybe just turn it down to a lower temperature at least, for example, overnight. Do you live in a castle or do you live in a tent? Some of our homes are thermally massive with sort of a lot of hard stone surfaces that absorb a lot of heat as the sun comes in, or even wooden surfaces can do that a lot. But carpeted floors insulate the floor, so heat isn't absorbed into the floor. A castle takes a very, very long time to heat up. But a yurt or a porter cabin, which is perhaps more familiar to us, just not as attractive to do as a picture, is much quicker to heat up. You can pop a wood stove in the middle of a yurt and you can very quickly have warm space in there. Appallingly badly insulated. I'm not advocating living in a yurt, not in a British climate at least, but they do heat up quickly because they've got no thermal mass in the walls to absorb that heat. A porter cabin's like that, a site hut. You go into it, you can put the heating on and it'll be quickly hot. Turn the heating off and it doesn't hang around. Whereas your castle, if you've got a room warm, and you may never be able to get a room warm in a castle, or many churches struggle with getting warm, they take a long time to cool down again. They hold on to that heat and they keep redelivering it. So is your home more of a castle or more of a porter cabin, more of a tent? That will determine how long you need your timer on before the house really is warmed up, and how long you can turn it off before you no longer need to be comfortably warm. I mean, if you were living in a castle, you don't need to worry about, you can let the fire die down or whatever a few hours before bedtime, because the walls will still be as warm as they ever were, unless you're relying on the radiant heat from the fire and enjoying that. That's a different story. So smart controls, of course, are quite possible by phone or by tablet or whatever. Now, remote timing, managing your central heating from a distance. When you're on the way home on the train, you can turn it on. Hopefully you've set it so that it'll go off when you leave the house or before you leave the house in the morning. It may even include GPS, sensing when you're on your way home and turn it on for you. It may include weather reference, so that when the weather's warmer, it reduces the heating. When it's colder, it turns it up for you, or it turns it on sooner and gets it ready. This sort of controls may have multiple users, so different members of the household may be able to manage it. I could quite imagine that that could enable quite a lot of contest between different occupants of the house. Ever noticed anybody else going to change the thermostat that you thought was okay? We don't all want the same things. We don't all necessarily feel it works the same way. But anyway, and some of these smart devices can learn household habits, so they can expect that the house is broadly likely to be empty Monday to Friday between 8 and 5 or whatever like that, and keep the heating turned down at that point, but have it ready for people to get up in the morning at 6:30 or 7 o'clock or whatever the household needs. And yes, they can cope with weekly patterns, daily patterns across a week, as well as hours across the day. Examples of these smart ones, there will be more, but Hive, Nest, Tado, Clymote are names that come up for smart in that sort of way. So we've looked at controlling the heating demand. We now want to look, we've done that as much as we can, or we're going to do that as much as we can. How are we going to heat our homes? We know that we can't go on using gas and oil, burning hydrocarbons, producing carbon dioxide, increasing the level of carbon dioxide in the air. And anyway, there's a limit to how much gas and oil there ever was. The Centre for Alternative Technology, where I teach, started 45, 50 years ago, actually looking at alternative technologies being needed because we were running out of gas and oil. Of course, the focus has changed to looking at climate change, looking at sustainability across the environment, as well as climate change. But we've got a lot of reasons to be moving away from gas and oil. So let's look at electricity, which we know how to do very easily. We've got fan heaters, we've got radiant heaters, we've got radiators, which aren't radiant heaters, they're mostly convectors. And we've got combinations, and some of them are smarter, and we might choose for different reasons, for different types for different reasons. But over a year, we're going to need more electricity than we're currently generating from renewables if we go this route of just using electricity to produce heat. And we're going to need 6, 8, 10 times more in winter than we are in summer. Can we generate 6 or 8 or 10 times more in winter than we can in summer? Anybody who's got PV on the roof, does yours generate more in winter or in summer? Well, I'm guessing I know the answer and you know the answer. And it's not the way around that we want it. It does tend to be windier in the winter, not necessarily that much windier, not necessarily that, 8 or 10 times windier in the winter. And sometimes we get really quiet spells for as much as 3 weeks at a time. So we're definitely going to need storage. We can store heat. If you wanted to store enough heat to heat your home through the winter, a back of an envelope calculation suggests that you could store that much heat by having a swimming pool type tank underneath your house built, but that would need to have approximately the same volume as your whole house, be filled with that much water, and not to spring leaks. If you're going to sort of hold as much heat as you use in the house in water over the winter. Well, you might say, well, surely we can find something better than water. There are phase change materials which have advantages and disadvantages, but in terms of a heat capacity of water, it's about the highest of any medium without changing phase, so without melting or boiling. Rocks are an alternative, but they're not quite as good in terms of how much weight, how much mass of rocks. They may be denser in physical cubic meters terms. But yes, how you extract the heat from it too is another one. So they're all challenging. So onward from electricity. What was next on that list? Hydrogen. Well, hydrogen is, of course, the answer to everything. We all know that, hydrogen, you can get hydrogen from splitting up water. There's plenty of hydrogen around in the water, and we can burn hydrogen. Hydrogen burns, with a pop from a test tube at school. You can actually burn it in, either in a mixture with methane, which is the gas you use in your cooker, or on its own. And it can produce high temperatures if it's organized so to do. You can get a boiler that's suited to hydrogen. You can compress and store hydrogen to some extent in the distribution network, which gives you some security of supply. And that's great because we've been talking about the challenge of storage. And that's really important. So, yep, there's some big advantages to hydrogen, but you may have heard in my voice, it's not all advantages. Hydrogen is quite expensive to produce, as if you're using electricity for electrolyzing water, splitting that H2O into H2 and O2, then you can be up to 80% efficient. So you're only losing about a fifth of the original energy. And hydrogen can be produced this way and is produced this way, but look, about 0.1%, that's 1,000th of the hydrogen currently produced is produced this way. This sort is known as green hydrogen, green in terms of environmentally about as good as you can get. The more common way of producing hydrogen is by steam reforming natural gas, methane. So CH4, methane, carbon and hydrogen combined with oxygen, or combine with water to produce carbon dioxide and hydrogen. So with steam, water vapor, and the hydrogen produced is known as grey hydrogen. Now, we don't want that carbon dioxide. Well, we don't want very much of it. You may want fizzy drinks, and you may be interested in the brewing industry, and there may be there are various industrial processes that need carbon dioxide. So we need some of it for a few things, but we don't need anything like as much as if we were producing all the hydrogen we need for heating, all the energy we need for heating into hydrogen this way. So we've got a challenge with the CO2 that we're producing. Carbon capture and storage, great. Well, surprisingly enough, there's a fair amount of people out there saying, yes, of course, we can use carbon capture and storage. That's the answer to it all. But yes, we've seen it work at lab scale. It hasn't yet been developed at a larger scale. In fact, it's not necessarily any closer to being available at larger scale at anything like an economic level. Well, it probably is closer than nuclear fusion, but it's one of these, oh yes, we'll be able to do that in some years' time. And some years' time is not defined. We don't really know. But anyway, if you hear the terms green hydrogen, grey hydrogen, blue hydrogen, those are the different processes. As when Flo looked through this for me, she pointed out grey hydrogen, and then I looked them up. And you can also get brown and purple and pink hydrogen. Go have a look and see what those mean. I think they're to do with coal and oil and possibly biomass. Can't remember what the pink one was. Used for some of the original hydrocarbons produced, used at this stage. So any of these processes allow hydrogen to be produced from spare electricity. That's a really nice, useful thing. So if you're on Orkney or on the Outer Hebrides, you can put up wind turbines and you can, well, I mean, there's plenty of wind up there. It's windy. We used to visit my sister on Shetland, and they reckon there's probably half a day a year when the wind stops. It's windy, the wind blows, it blows hard. There's plenty of wind resource. So if you've got wind turbines, you won't necessarily be using all the electricity all of the time. The production doesn't match consumption. So you're going to have some spare electricity. So you can produce hydrogen from that. You can produce it by any of these. Right, now I've got a question about hydrogen. Yes. Vince is saying, skeptical about hydrogen. There are no hydrogen mines. You have to manufacture it, as we've been talking about. To liquefy it, it has to be at very high pressure, which takes a great deal of energy and leakage, and boil-off losses are high, especially as it's transferred between storage media. Yep. Compression and or cooling it right down, cryogenics, have that problem that you have to use a lot of energy to achieve them, and recapturing that energy in the ways that you need to are basically just very challenging. Thanks, Vince, for that. Were there any other questions higher up that I've missed? No, thank you.
I was just making the point there, really, that if you've got spare electricity from your wind turbine, why not just use a battery or a bank of batteries?
Yes, I haven't really included batteries here. Hydrogen, well, we'll go on to uses of hydrogen in just a moment, but there are different advantages to hydrogen. Batteries too, there's a lot of chemical intensity in batteries. We may be limited as to how much battery we can make without essentially raping the planet for lithium, etc. Yeah. Let's carry on and come to that perhaps. Yes, Jeff says CCS, carbon capture and storage, does work on some schemes, but depends on the market prices. Oh, thanks. Your recent article in New Scientist. Okay. I think a challenge with carbon capture and storage is that it uses a lot of energy to capture that carbon dioxide. And if it's using, let's say, half of the energy that's being generated, that's been used to generate the electricity and that's been generated as electricity, then that electricity is essentially twice as expensive once you've captured the carbon dioxide from it. So I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure whether it's sort of 50%, but it's not far off, I think, as far as I've heard as yet. And of course, these things, the efficiencies can improve. Chris saying, if you have natural gas, then why not use that rather than making hydrogen? Well, the advantage here is that if you produce your hydrogen by steam reformation, and then you can capture the the CO2, because you can do that at scale. You can then make hydrogen that can be burnt cleanly. Whereas if you're burning natural gas at a domestic level, you're not going to be able to capture your carbon dioxide at a domestic level. Is that all right, Chris? Hope so. Come back at me if not. So hydrogen's got a variety of uses. We can drive electric cars. That's just fine. And I'm sure a number of you have electric cars and you find they're working well. Hydrogen's an alternative for cars, hydrogen may be a better alternative for heavy transport, trains, tractors, aeroplanes, that would need sort of, extra substantial batteries and whatever. Aeroplanes are never going to be able to carry enough battery to run very far on electricity. They might be able to manage that more usefully on hydrogen. So it's got the potential for energy storage for electricity generation when wind and solar run out. Basically, those 3 weeks in January when the wind's dropped and you've got precious little solar hitting your PVs, we need some resilience in the system there. But we can only use every unit of hydrogen once. So every cubic meter that we've generated, that we've produced from electrolysis or steam reformation, we can only either use it in a car or in a tractor to produce food, or in a lorry or a train to transport that food or whatever else, products around the place, or we can use it for heating. We can't use that same cubic meter, that same kilowatt hour, even going into smaller units, for everything. So we've got some challenges there. Sorry, I need to move my bar of people. Oh yes, and in terms of quantity, the government is targeting production, that means we're not doing it yet, of 5 gigawatts of hydrogen by 2030. Targeting that for 8 years' time, and that's about a 20th of our current methane use, natural gas use. So using it for heating, cars, trains, tractors, energy storage, we're going to need huge amounts more rather than that small amount at the moment. But that's what they think is reasonable at the moment to target. Heat pumps are another way of providing heat in homes. They're energy multipliers. They can move energy from one place to another and multiply it. They work rather like this domestic fridge, and I'll remove that so that we can see the words. They multiply the energy from electricity. So using a single unit of electricity, they can draw perhaps 2 units of heat from the air or from the ground, from water, and deliver 3 units of heat into the house. On that basis, that heat pump would have a coefficient of performance of 3. 1 unit of electricity delivering 3 units of heat to the house. At different source temperatures, that's air or water or ground temperatures, and different destination temperatures, that's your underfloor heating or your radiators or your hot water tank, your coefficient of performance is going to be different. You get a higher coefficient of performance when the demand temperature is close to the source temperature, when it doesn't have to do very much work. It's more efficient. Coefficient of performance is a sort of efficiency, essentially, in lots of ways. So 1 unit of electricity joining up with 2 units of heat from the air or the ground, producing 3 units of energy delivered to heat, gives a coefficient of performance of 3, a COP. Now just think about the temperatures of source and destination. When you need to heat the house, is that when it's warmer or colder outside? Air source heat pumps are the most readily available, the most attractive sort of heat pump. This is an outdoor unit, and they mostly are outdoor units. They've got a fan system, drawing air through past some coils, taking taking heat by a refrigeration type unit and delivering the heat into your cylinder. And your fridge, your fridge in your kitchen is taking heat from that bottle of milk that you put in it and dumping it out of the back into your kitchen. It's moving heat from one place to another. Yeah, it's using electricity to do it, moving it from a cooler place to a hotter place. The laws of physics say you can't do it without putting extra energy in, so you put extra energy in and you do it. You need to use electricity to do it. So this outdoor air source heat pump is producing heat to go into a cylinder unit, a storage, pardon me, a storage cylinder here. And from this, we can get a heat supply for underfloor heating, for our radiators, and for having our shower in, doing the washing, whatever, sanitary hot water. And a typical coefficient of performance, you can see how that varies between the underfloor heating, where it's, the delivery temperature is 35 degrees, underfloor heating at typical coefficient of performance perhaps of 3. Large radiators, quite often it makes sense to double the thickness of your radiators, perhaps to expand the area of them in order to be able to heat the rooms at 45 to 50, water of 45 to 50 in the radiators rather than the standard sort of 60 plus, 55 to 60 plus in the radiators that we mostly use. So the coefficient of performance for that is perhaps 2.5. And then for hot water, higher temperature, 60 degrees is recommended for storage, a typical coefficient of performance of under 2. So it's still doing better, it's still multiplying, that's bigger than 1. And this is for an air temperature in the winter, 0 to 4 degrees. Okay, so this is when we need most of our heating. But ground source heat pumps are more efficient. Oh, yes, okay, sorry, seasonal performance factor. Yes, in the summer, the coefficient of performance may be much better because your underfloor heating is 35, your temperature outside the house is 20, not 0 to 4. Mind you, if it's 20, I don't know why you need any heating on at all, but the coefficient of performance at that point would be higher. So it's really important to look at and to ask questions. If you're looking at an air source heat pump, ask questions about the seasonal coefficient of performance or the seasonal performance factor, SCOP or SPF there. And if your air source heat pump installer doesn't know about those, or salesman doesn't know about those, then don't go with that firm, or go to somebody who does know about those. Coefficient of performance for a heat pump is measured at specific laboratory standards, and it'll be a figure that is quoted for a heat pump, but it may not refer in any useful way to how it would work in your home. And you'll have heard of ground source heat pumps. With a fair amount of digging, you can lay coils under the ground in your garden or under the road, or you can lay them vertically down boreholes. You need quite an area of them, at least in the area the same sort of size as the house, and that's for a well-insulated house. So that's quite a lot of disruption to your garden, and you need to go deep, because the whole point of a ground source heat pump is your ground temperature stays warmer in the winter than the air does. So the air temperature may drop down to 0 or -5 or -10 from time to time in the winter, but the ground temperature in December and January will not be likely to go below about 8 degrees. It's the average year-round temperature of the air around the surface of the ground. And because that gives us a narrower difference between the temperature under the ground and the temperature of your underfloor heating need, 35 degrees, then you've got a higher coefficient of performance. and a higher one for the radiators and a higher one for the hot water than the air source heat pumps, which, you know, setting these next to each other, you can see the comparison there. Sorry, I didn't, you know, specify that those are air source heat pump, ground source heat pump, but those are there. We've got a river at the bottom of the garden, and it would be really nice to be able to extract heat from that, but we'd have to go through all sorts of hoops with the Environment Agency, probably quite rightly, because we'd be changing the viability of the water for what else lives in it, really, and what else depends on it. And then people from across the other side of the river might want to take heat out of it as well. And that, you know, we're competing for a resource there. So it's quite right that it's not necessarily easy. Any questions at that point? Oh, Vince, does extracting heat from a ground source lower the temperature of the ground, making the system less efficient over time? It's really important to keep the thing in balance. And that's why you have quite so much in the way of area of your coils in the ground, that you're only taking a small amount of heat out and you give the ground time to recover. It's got the capacity to recover. You can actually use a ground source heat pump also in cooling mode. So you can take heat out of the house and dump it into the ground, and that possibly improves the the recovery of the ground temperature and the readiness of the temperature you can achieve. If you were needing to cool during the day and heat during the night or something like that, that would be perfect. It doesn't, the ground 5 feet, 2 meters under isn't going to hold very much heat between summer and winter. But to the extent of adding extra heat, it does obviously. I mean, that's why the temperature stays at 8 to 12. It does hold heat. Depends very much on whether you're on clay, sand, gravel, whether you've got water running through it, whether you've got air spaces in whatever it is. The connectivity against the loops, the ground source heat coil, is particularly important on that. Yes.
Ian B was asking Francis about noise pollution from presumably from the fans.
From the heat pump units, the air source heat pump units. Yes, there are constraints on that. You do have to be a certain distance. Your heat pump has to be a certain distance from neighbours. Essentially, an air source heat pump should not need to be noisy at all. 40 dB, I think, is quoted, and that's really very quiet. But it does depend on how well they're commissioned, how well they're set up by whoever's installed them. So if you, I mean, a friend of ours in, well into the centre of Manchester, in a terrace house, was asking about air source heat pumps, and they've got a standard position in a terrace house where their backyard is fenced in. It's basically, it would fill up with water if it was watertight, if you like. It's a complete surround there, and you've got a problem there that even if you could get the air source heat pump far enough from your neighbours, if you take the heat out of the air, then you're going to have a cold reservoir of air sitting just outside your back door. And you're going to be trying to extract heat from what's then become a cold reservoir of air as well, because cold air sinks compared to the warm air around. It won't necessarily sort of billow away over the fences and things, just in the same way that if it, yeah. So yes, Ian, environmental noise is a concern. Positioning of heat pumps and correct installation and commissioning is really important, but I think you might find it difficult to get past planning on the basis of concerns about noise. Currently, heat pumps are expensive. Ground source heat pumps more expensive than air source heat pumps because of the groundworks that are needed. The the technology, once you get the machinery there, possibly is more expensive, simply because there must be at least 20 air source heat pumps sold for every ground source heat pump, and we know the benefits of scale on that sort of thing. But essentially it's the groundworks. You can bore a hole into the ground, that's going to cost you money too. And then of course we're using electricity, and currently electricity costs us a lot more than gas. Now there's all sorts going on at the moment about whether or not it should, particularly if your electricity is coming from a green supplier, Good Energy or whoever else, Ecotricity, who are generating most of their electricity, at least from wind turbines and solar, much cheaper than gas is becoming. So watch this space in terms of the relative cost of electricity and gas, and therefore potentially the increasing viability of heat pumps. Let's hope so. To some extent, it needs enough of us buying heat pumps to transform the market and bring the cost of heat pumps down. Now, I know some of you bought solar PV, installed it on the roof 10, 12, 15 years ago. Well, no, probably not 15, 10 or 12 years ago, and got really good incentivization to do so. The feed-in tariff was incentivizing you to put out that outlay to build a market in photovoltaics, and the cost of putting PV on the roof has dropped by 80% or something like that, I think now, which is why we no longer have feed-in tariffs, because the government reckons it's done that job, and it has done a really good job of bringing the cost down. Now, if we could have similar incentivization for heat pumps, there's no real reason to suppose it wouldn't do the same. There's no real reason to suppose that heat pumps would become significantly more efficient, but they would become cheaper. And then, of course, when it comes to the cost of electricity and gas, we're talking politics here about, where there's a subsidy, what's taxed. At the moment, taxes are on electricity and not on gas, which is pushing up the price of electricity and keeping gas prices down. Heat pump installers, specific industry standards or qualifications that we should be looking for. I'm not an expert on that, Mark. I'm really sorry. There is a heat pump industry that you'd go to find out more. If you'd like to drop me an email, I'll rack my brains and contact the person I know who would know that, and see if I can answer that one. So yes, we just talked about the positioning of air source heat pumps on small houses. So where do we go from there? We've sort of said electricity is too expensive to use, in terms of we can't generate enough of it to just use electricity. We've talked about hydrogen, and the prospects of producing enough hydrogen to be using that for heating in anything like the near future are pretty small. Heat pumps, there's some quite significant challenges. I don't think they're impossible, heat pumps challenges by any means, particularly to those of us who live with wall space that's far enough away from our neighbours that we're not going to be worrying them too much. I mean, your fridge doesn't make very much noise. It doesn't need to be very much more than that, and you've got much better, potentially much better trained and qualified installers for heat pumps than you have for the fridge that you're just moving in from the warehouse. And then there's going to be planning constraints on air source heat pumps for some of these reasons. So, or centralized or district heating. All right, again, I'm losing my, perhaps using centralized heat pumps and a supply from those. So let's have a look at what district heating might mean and involve. I've lost track of what time it is. Can somebody tell me?
gone 8:30.
We're doing okay then. Thank you. I kept my phone
We're
out.
doing fine. We're doing fine. Thank you, Francis. Thanks.
Okay, I kept my phone out of here so it didn't disturb. I can't deal with it. So we're on to district heating. We're doing fine. So a heating network may be useful. I mean, we still are burning waste, incinerating waste, as well as sending it to landfill. And, you know, why should we be wasting that heat? Unfortunately, most of us don't choose to live near incinerator plants and have it readily available to, you know, to use as heat in our homes. Heat can be transported, it can be piped. In Bristol, they're actually talking of putting hot water from the incinerator out at Avonmouth into hot water into barges to bring up into the city centre to feed a heating network in the city centre. I don't think we're going to be doing that in Handforth or Wilmslow, but you know, heat is to some extent transportable, and we can accumulate heat from, this is just one source. These two may be demanding heat. These are, you know, industries or schools or whatever they are. But we could have a series of different heat generators on these loops. So we could have a series of heat pumps with coils across the road, under the roads, coils across the playing fields. Solar water heating on roofs. I haven't gone into solar water heating, but you know, those are all possibilities of producing heat for the network. The challenge with solar water heating, to be perfectly honest, is it is good for water heating. In terms of space heating, it's totally out of sync with the seasonal energy demand for heating. You need heat in the winter, and when you get heat onto your solar water heating panels, that's in the summer. You don't harvest very much from them in the winter. I like them, they save carbon dioxide emissions, but they're not really an answer for heating our homes.
Francis, we have an interesting one from Robin. Are air source heat pumps not covered under permitted development? I mean, that might be one for Lata to answer. My own reaction would be, no, it's totally different aspect of planning, but does anyone know the technical answer? Hands up if you do.
They're not automatically permitted.
No. No, I'm
Don't know
sure,
if I can find out.
I'm sure they're not. Or perhaps launch a little bit of homework for you and
Yes.
send an email around. That would be great. Thank you. Sorry, Francis.
Yes, and where are the constraints locally
Yes.
on whether or not air source heat pumps are permittable, and what do people reckon? I mean, I think, you know, some of our friends who have, I know Gary Olson has got, I mean, it's not a case of the aesthetics. You can put a big battery system on the front of your house. So it's not the aesthetics of putting a heat pump on the front of your house, for example. Yes, and I think you have to apply for permission before you install it. We're still at that point. And you might well be expected to put it around the back of the house rather than on the front. I think there's quite a tension between permissions on planning and the needs of moving forward to help manage climate impacts. I'll leave that there for now. Float that idea and leave it for now. So yes, I mean, networks for heating can vary a lot in size and length. You know, Copenhagen as a city is very largely heat networked. Universities, hospitals may well be heat networked. They may or may not be using sustainable heating, you know, but where there's a heat network already, perhaps you can use that. Perhaps you can add to the heat in it initially by using ground source heat pumps and gradually increase the amount of sustainable heating that's going into the network. it can be water, it can be steam. I don't think you'd get very far in terms of heat networks from heat pumps by using steam, simply because you're talking of such a high temperature there. You can use heat networks at a variety of different temperatures. It would be possible in this sort of setting to be moving hot water around the system at a quite intermediate temperature. You could be delivering it at the temperature that you need for your hot water at 60, or you could be moving it around at something more like 35. And if you're moving it around at 35, you could have individual heat pumps in each block of flats or even in each individual home that were able to draw heat from 35 degrees and boost it to 60, rather than having to draw it from the outside air at 4 degrees in winter, let's say, and boost it to 60 at a much lower coefficient of performance. So there are different ways of integrating the different possibilities. That's what your district heating transfer systems might look like. Digging great trenches like that, which will be covered over, of course, afterwards, and you're looking at really well insulated pipework with a flow and return, and you can have flow and return in the same insulated bound for smaller heat networks, but these would be, there'd be one each of those. You've got slightly less insulation on your return because you're bringing it back cooler. And there's a lot of different sources that can be, heat networks can be supplied from a whole series of different sources, all on one network. It's not just in the same way that our electricity grid is supplied from a series of different generators. Your power stations don't just generate electricity, they actually probably produce twice as much heat as they do electricity. Our thermal power stations, whether they're thermal nuclear or whether they're thermal coal, oil, or even the gas turbine, producing a lot of heat along with the electricity they're generating. Energy from waste, incinerators, or whatever process they're using. A lot of industrial and commercial processes are needing to get rid of heat. In fact, an awful lot of stores and supermarkets are not one of them, but a lot of, Next up the road here in Handforth, probably M&S and Boots at the other end of the Handforth Dean there are needing to extract heat, and they're dumping heat out into the air, out into the backyard. Now, if they had the opportunity of dumping it into water and they were rewarded by feeding their heat into something, that could be used to be delivered to local housing for heating purposes, or local schools or whatever else. They might need to use a heat pump to achieve temperatures that are appropriate. Or we might be using heat pumps to extract heat from the air or from the delivery roads around, or from the playing fields, or whatever else. It's quite possible to use electric boilers to add to the heat in heat networks, and we might be using solar thermal arrays. We might have huge solar thermal arrays that were able to add usefully to heat networks. We've never really looked at huge solar thermal arrays here, but they are known. They've happened elsewhere. And of course, you don't just need to be able to be producing as much heat as, at 6 o'clock in the afternoon as you're using at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. You can put your heat into hot water tanks, essentially thermal stores, and draw the heat out on the other side of that. So you can build up heat in a store and draw it down. So you've got essentially a heat battery there to smooth your variations in energy supply and demand. And they can be used for cooling. And that's a bit of a different story. If you want to look at absorption cooling, which uses heat for a cooling process, then absorption or adsorption cooling but there's a nice YouTube that you can put into your internet and get there. Okay, search engine, get there. And oh right, okay, I've duplicated that, sorry. And if you're using a heat network at intermediate temperatures, then you could be cooling offices that are overheating, for example. Offices with a lot of people in and a lot of IT and lighting as well, and sun coming in the windows very readily overheat and need a cooling process. So you've got air conditioning going on. Well, you could be using your heat network to improve the efficiency of that cooling. So in summary, there's no one solution fits all. Our different homes and offices and schools and whatever else need subtly different approaches. But priority is going to be to reduce your demand. Reduce it by air tightness, by insulation, and by control and management. And I should have put that to animate so that went red, because that's the first and most really important. But then ideally, and well, I mean, they're all important. Ideally, probably a district heating or heat pump system, because we're not there yet with producing enough hydrogen. We're not there yet with producing enough electricity to go for direct electric heating. So we're going to need to go for heat pumps and or district heating in order to achieve it. In order to size your heat pump, you really need to know the size of your heat demand, which does mean that you really need to do your demand reduction first, or at least you need to know what you're doing in terms of demand reduction so that you get a heat pump that's the right sort of scale. It's much more important to do that than it actually is with a gas boiler. A plumber will probably put in a gas boiler that's about twice the size that you need, because that's a reasonable level of resilience. Well, you don't want a heat pump turning on and off and turning on and off. It's not good for it to do that. So it needs to be sized more precisely than that. So the deciding factors, whether you're going for which of these, are around the size of demand, the building density and the space around dwellings. So where you've got houses close together, you can quite imagine that the district heating system delivers more efficiently where you haven't got to carry that hot water so far between source and between different delivery points. So if you've got high density terraced housing or blocks of flats, or your blocks of flats with a school, blocks of flats whatever with industry and whatever, you haven't got so far to take things, then you've got more potential for district heating. Pardon me. I need that glass of water, Helen. I've got one for you. So essentially, we really need political policy to support and incentivize transition to heat pumps and district heating, and to do it properly. And I think that's really where that comes to. I've got a series of resources here, as always, the Energy Saving Trust, but also the London Energy Transformation Initiative, LETI, is great for information on this sort of thing. Regen, I can't remember what that stands for, if it stands for something. It's renewable energy generation, I think, essentially, and it's a part of the generation distribution network with anchors in Wales and the southwest, and I'm not sure where else. And then Energy Systems Catapult, and the documents that I would, start you off with on this, quite apart from their websites, the Climate Emergency Retrofit Guide from LETI, Decarbonisation of Heat from Regen, and Innovating to Net Zero from Energy Systems Catapult. And Innovating to Net Zero and the Decarbonisation of Heat are both quite good on on where the sort of the politics of the charging for gas and electricity and that sort of thing, the policies on those need to go. Innovating to Net Zero is quite an advocate of, well, is assuming that carbon capture and storage is going to happen. So I would critique it on that, but there we go. It's got a lot of other good stuff in it. It's much more focused on electricity, innovating to net zero. And I think really, we've done a lot of the thinking on electricity. We've got to work out how to do the heating side of it. So I think Jeff's making a point in the chat rather than the question there. So I'm ready for questions. Anybody who feels you've got questions that you'd like to pursue, or maybe they're not questions, but points to broadly bring into discussion with everybody. Over to you, Stuart.
Francis, that is absolutely amazing. That is really, really interesting. Can I kick off with just one observation from myself? And that is, I was really surprised at the low percentage of demand met by nuclear. Bearing in mind the cost and the infrastructure and the gestation time on nuclear, that disappoints me. Am I alone in that, or was I just expecting too much?
I think that's for other people here rather than me.
Stuart, the nuclear industry, a lot of the Magnox reactors are very aged. And there's quite a lot of research being done at Manchester University on how they can be extended the life. It's the graphite moderators that are causing the problem. Their life has been extended, but they are going to be put in as a base load for wind and solar, because recently we've not been getting much wind at all. You can actually see what your generation is hour by hour by looking at certain websites. But getting back to the nuclear, what they're doing is putting in new stations, and Rolls-Royce are going to develop a medium-sized nuclear station which can be used as for base load. But the amount of electricity that was generated went up to about 20% on nuclear, and it's often base load. But they're being retired, and a lot have been taken out of service, as
Right.
they are indeed in France. But
So
France
we've
is
passed the peak,
expanding
Jeff, is
again.
what you're saying. We've passed the peak for the moment in terms
Yes.
of proportion.
Yes,
Right.
they've been neglected, and I think because they thought that we had cheap gas. A bit the same with district heating. District heating is a wonderful system. The trouble was that cheap gas came along. There weren't good heat meters. It was installed pretty badly. You could see where the mains were on a cold day because the snow melted above them. And they were a great problem. The diversity of a district heating system, it was using 50% of its energy in the summer just for domestic hot water because the losses were so bad. So we did a very bad job, but a lot of the London big estates, like the Roehampton one, which looks over Roehampton Park, were actually designed with district heating schemes in. And they're a first-class system if they're done properly, but we go for the cheapest cost and we get a shoddy job that doesn't work.
Well, thank you for that. Mel throws an interesting thought into the pot. What about the emphasis on heating the body? That sounds interesting. Anyone got any thoughts on that?
Well,
Mel,
it's radiant
don't mute
heating.
and
You
I'll
can have
hear-
radiant heaters that just shine straight on your body. But, well, as Francis will tell you, your comfort depends on half your air temperature and half your radiant temperature. So you can satisfy a radiant temperature, and some churches have radiant heating, where you have heaters from above and they heat you rather than the air. But you've still got the situation of you can get quite warm, but the air is fairly cold. So you take the average temperature of the radiant temperature and the air temperature. But of course, for people like me with not too much hair on top, they're rather oppressive.
You just have to wear a hat. You have to wear a hat, Jeff.
Yes, I can't wear a hat in chapel, Francis.
Well, that's absolutely fantastic. I
No,
think
certainly following up from what Mel's saying there in terms of, yeah, I mean, wearing clothes that warm you, not just that keep you warm. It's an interesting exploration that I think there's got to be some testing done and to see how that works for people.
it's all walking around with our USB wires looking for a plug-in.
Yes. Yes, don't let's go back to little charcoal burners under our skirts, please.
We're doing pretty well. Have we got any more questions? Because I am watching time a little bit. Do pop your hand up or unmute yourself for the moment. Well, of all the people that are here tonight, there's one that I know has done a huge amount in terms of the efficiency of her own home, retrofitting and various other initiatives. And that's Mel herself, Mel Harris. So Mel, I think it would be quite a fitting thing if I asked you to say a few words to just wind up tonight's discussion.
Thank you. I'd be honoured to do so. Also, I think what I've done, I should just set the record straight. It's only good, you know, up to a point. I mean, us relatively early adopters, every month, every year, there's more and more things I wish I'd thought about and tackled, and will be doing so retrospectively. I wanted to try and future-proof my house. I had an amazing opportunity to do a huge renovation of a property in not very good condition, because I thought that it would be great to grow old in it and not be too cold. I just didn't realise the future would come so soon. And I think that's why we're you know, why all of this is so important. And I really, really appreciate Francis going through everything in such measured detail and focus. I was hoping that hydrogen was nearer. Everybody's getting new gas boilers that are hydrogen ready. It seems that we may still have some time to wait. I really liked the opening of your talk, Francis, because it reminded me of Tim Harford on More or Less, with that statistic of 41% being a complete red herring in a way. I'm very interested, because I am all electric, in the tax subsidy switching from renewable electricity sources to the expense that, you know, to carbon, to fossil fuels, but we're still stuck in that. I really look forward to that changing, but thank you for flagging that up. It just seems unfair that electricity is more expensive than gas still. Thank you for highlighting the colours of hydrogen. I've made a note of that. Might be we can make up some kind of rainbow song about that, perhaps, to get clearer. And I think, as ever, you know, the rallying cry politically to government is more joined up thinking. I mean, we look at new estates going up all the time, and you're thinking, well, there's an opportunity to, while you're digging up the earth, to put in some ground source heat pumps and make sure everybody has access to, you know, a good fossil-free form of heating. But I bet your bottom dollar that's not happening yet. So anyway, thank you. A real vote of thanks from me on behalf of everybody for your talk tonight. It was absolutely terrific.
And if you'd all care to unmute, we will give Francis our thanks in the traditional way. Thank you very much indeed, Francis. Well, folks, sad though it seems, that brings us to the end of the events, the talks for the Festival of Nature. Those that would like to join the Wilmslow Civic Trust next Wednesday, we have our own Ray Acton talking about James Smithies, Wilmslow's metalwork artist, and I think that will be very, very interesting indeed. We'll see, just if you'll excuse the pun, we'll see how James Smithies shapes the future for Wilmslow. Thank you all for attending. It's been great fun. And thank you again to those who added questions and variety to Francis's talk. It's been very good of you, Francis, to respond on the go. I always think that's very, very difficult and not lose your thread. So So well done from me as well. So everybody, take care and look forward to seeing you soon, one way or the other. Good night, everyone.
Thank you,
Good night.
Steve.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.